Professor Steve Rabe, thank you very much for coming and visiting UNC Chapel Hill today. You're one of America's leading scholars on the history of Latin America and the United States during the Cold War and indeed during the 20th century. What made you interested in the first place to really specialize on Latin America?
Well, I think that when, as a graduate student, it was probably somewhat of a pragmatic choice. I chose to study with Thomas Patterson, who was a very famous historian of U.S. foreign relations, and because I had access to the Spanish language, that was probably a reason. And I also thought there was not a lot of good work on U.S. relations with Latin America, particularly work that might have taken a perspective on Latin Americans.
Thank you very much. Relations between the United States and Cuba have been particularly fraught ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis and before. Now we see a sort of normalization in place. What do you make of that relationship? Why did it take so long for the United States to, some people would say, see reason?
Well, I think that the basic problem is that the United States traditionally has been the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. And for 50 years, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution has stuck its thumb in the U.S. eye and gotten away with it. That it has defied the Colossus of the North. It's been very difficult for U.S. citizens and U.S. policymakers to accept that a Latin American nation could act autonomously.
Right, thank you. So the United States always has had an attitude of superiority towards Latin America?
Well, I think that the United States has frequently always referred to Latin America as being in the backyard of the United States, which strikes me as rather condescending and patronizing tone. I once heard a Mexican diplomat say perhaps we could begin to change relations and understand one another better if you perceived yourself, you as U.S. citizens, as sitting in our front yard.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the many countries in Latin America and relations with the United States, which countries would you single out where the relationship has been particularly difficult, particularly complex?
Well, obviously the relationship with Cuba since 1898 was very complex. It was very complex even in the period prior to Fidel Castro. I would say probably also Argentina, U.S.-Argentine relations have often been difficult, in part because the two nations had complementary economies in terms of beef and wheat, and so there was always challenges in terms of export and trade. So that particularly Argentina would be a very difficult case along with Cuba.
Thank you. And there have been many military coups, many bloodbaths, many atrocities committed in many Latin American countries. And often American administrations, North American administrations, have been on the side of the right-wing dictator, of the military dictatorship. Why?
The United States has always sought security and stability in Latin America. While the United States favors democracy and human rights in general, security and stability have always been the major watchwords for U.S. policy in Latin America, because the United States has felt that in order to be a confident actor on the global stage in Europe and in Asia, it needed a secure and stable, quote-unquote, backyard.
And that is the difference between the United States' attitude to Latin America and perhaps to Europe or to Western Europe, Eastern Europe, to
That would
Asia.
be one reason, and then one must also bring in the issue of race, that U.S. citizens have often perceived Latin Americans as being darker-skinned people whose, at least in the 19th century, whose religion was different, being Catholic as opposed to Protestant, and a kind of certain sense that Latin Americans were less able than North American citizens.
Thank you. When one thinks about American relations towards, let's say, right-wing dictatorship, then the names of Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, and also Ronald Reagan come to mind. Were these politicians as culpable as some say, or is that really a mistaken interpretation?
I think you always have to understand that Latin Americans are the chief actors, and the Brazilian military overthrew a constitutional government in 1964. But it was encouraged by Lyndon Johnson to overthrow such a government. I think that Chileans might have overthrown Salvador Allende without the assistance of the Richard Nixon administration, but the historical reality is that the Richard Nixon administration aided the Chileans. It might have been...
Aided in what way?
Aided the Chileans in terms of encouraging them for the military to strike, and also funneling money to create political chaos in the country and economic disruption in the country, as well as denying Chile access to economic aid and loans in the international arena.
And you would say the same applies to Ronald Reagan and
Sure,
Sandinista?
Absolutely. I think that would be wrong. Latin Americans are their own agents. They are their own masters of their own destiny, but the United States often picked a side in certain Latin American political battles over the struggle for power and the distribution of resources, and almost inevitably in the Cold War they sided with those who claimed to be anti-communist.
Thank you very much. Democracy and economic development seems to have come to Latin America in the last few years. So are you more optimistic about the future?
Extremely. Latin America in many ways is the most peaceful area in the world. And of course there is constitutional governments throughout the region, and there has been significant economic development throughout the region. Latin Americans have also dealt with some of the things like a growing population. They have the population under control. Most Latin American countries, led by Brazil, are at zero population growth. And so I think that the long-term future of Latin America is relatively positive.
And relations with the United States?
Well, I think that relations with the United States does not give high priority to relations with Latin America at this particular time. But long term, I think that the relations between the United States and Latin America may change as the demography of the United States changes, as Latinos in the United States begin to exercise more political and social and economic power.
And will the United States in the future pay more attention to Latin America, or will Asia, Europe still be dominant?
I suspect because of the changing demography of the United States that over time the United States will interact more fully with Latin America. But interaction with Latin America at the present time is essentially peaceful interaction in terms of the exchange of people's goods, ideas, and information. I can't predict that a NAFTA would be extended to all of Latin America, but it's possible.
But immigration from Latin America, particularly from Mexico, into the United States is still a problem, isn't it?
Well,
or regarded as a problem.
It may be regarded as a problem. Actually, at the present time, immigration from Mexico, there's actually a net outflow of Mexicans back to Mexico as opposed to Mexicans moving into the United States. Most immigration at the present time into the United States from Latin America is from Central America, where things are not quite as good, where things are very unstable. But overall, I think that as Latin American politicians in the United States, politicians who have a Latin American heritage, it's almost inevitable, it seems to me, that they will turn their eyes somewhat more southward.
Thank you, but overall you seem to be optimistic.
At the present time, yes.
That's great to know. Thank you very much, Professor Stephen Rabe. Very much thank you for giving us your insights today.
Thank you for having me at the University of North Carolina.
Thank you.